Good morning. All right. I'm going to follow along with Pastor Kyle's current series that he's in. When he asked me to preach, I immediately thought of one character. His name is Gideon. We're probably all familiar with Gideon. And we're going to continue here with the series, The Extraordinary from the Ordinary. And which I'll be reading a little bit out of Judges chapter 6 and Judges chapter 7, if y'all want to go ahead and turn there. And to get us kind of caught up with where we fall in the book of Judges, I'll kind of speed us up to date a little bit. Gideon was a judge, and he was a mighty man of war in Israel. He was the youngest of a poor family from the tribe of Manasseh. God called him to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. Gideon's story is found in Judges chapters, between chapter 6 and chapter 8. And during Gideon's time, Israel was oppressed by the Midianites. The Israelites, they were not supposed to be like the surrounding nations in Canaan. God told them back in Exodus, where God commanded them to be different and not to bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but they were told to utterly overthrow them and completely break down all their statues and pillars. And so, how do we find ourselves with Israel under this oppression in Judges 6? Well, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites, they simply stopped fighting. They worshiped the local idols and gods, and God did as he said he would. He delivered them into the hands of their enemies. And so, at this point, the surrounding nations, they're oppressing Israel. But God did not forsake his people entirely. He raised up leaders or judges to deliver the Israelites. And we see this cycle repeating itself over and over again with Israel. Israel would get delivered from a place they shouldn't have been. God raises up a leader, delivers them again. Israel falls back. It's like this revolving wheel that Israel got stuck in for a period of time. And then once that judge or leader died, what happened? Well, they fell right back into worshiping all the idols of the nations around them. And so this cycle is continuing up to this point. The time of the Midianites, their oppression. According to Numbers chapter 3, the Midianites were almost completely wiped out during the time of Moses. But by the time of Gideon, some 230 to 240 years later, they were again a powerful nation. And since God's protection was no longer on Israel due to their own rebellion, the Midianites, they seized every opportunity they could to oppress Israel. They were pretty much seeking revenge. They would come to Israel as soon as the harvest time began, and they would leave once the harvest was over. The Midianites, they would take away all the harvest of it that the Israelites had worked for. They were out there tilling the fields and all that. Well, the Midianites would come in at harvest time, take everything they wanted to, kill as many Israelites as they wanted to. And then this happened for 7 years. And then the Israelites, they confessed their sin and they sought God's intervention. And God answered that prayer by giving them a leader, a judge. And we're going to read that this man is Gideon. And so we're going to start this morning with the call of Gideon. And in Judges chapter 6, I'm going to start by reading 2 verses here. Verses 11 and verse 12. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." So as we're introduced to Gideon, we find him hiding in a wine press threshing wheat, out of his fear for the Midianites. He feared they would find the wheat or see him threshing the wheat, and all would be lost, not only with his wheat, but even possibly his life. Gideon seems pretty boring and weak at this point. Nothing most of us would call extraordinary. But notice how the angel addressed Gideon there. He said to him, "O mighty man of valor." So essentially, the angel is addressing Gideon as a mighty warrior while he is hiding, threshing wheat, afraid to be found and lose his wheat and or possibly his life. How can that be? Well, I believe it's because God sees potential. God was addressing Gideon through his messenger, which is the angel, as a mighty warrior. You know, it shows that God sees what we can become through him, not just what we are in our present state. You know, he looks to what we are in him and who we are to be in him. You know, and, you know, we know, he looks to him to who will become in him. You know, this is how that you and I, you know, this is how we can be called the righteousness of God. Because in 2 Corinthians 5, that's how the scriptures address us as believers, you know, the righteousness of God. Well, how's that possible? Well, God looks at us and he sees who we are in him. You know, God sees your potential this morning and he calls you where you are today to step out and live up to your potential in him, which he has provided through Christ. Let's go ahead here. I'm going to pick up back at verse 13. I'm going to read all the way through verse 17. Verse 13. And Gideon said to him, "Please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian." And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you?" And he said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least of my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." And he said to him, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me." I believe Gideon's response here is much like how we respond, you know, or even have responded to God. Gideon could not believe what he was hearing, that a man as weak as he was, timid, from the weakest family of the smallest tribe in Israel, could be chosen to deliver his nation. You know, many of us, when God asks us or calls us to do something, immediately we have the perfect excuse of why not. How can I blank because of blank? Our excuse might not be that we're the least in our family, but it may be, I don't know enough. I'm not prepared. I wouldn't know what to say. I couldn't afford that. I'm not qualified, or fill in the blank. Then after our excuses, we often want a sign of confirmation, just as Gideon asked a sign from the Lord that he had indeed chosen him. He told God, "Show me a sign that it is you who talks with me." You know, though we didn't read it yet, but in the next few verses, it details the sign that Gideon requested was that the Lord would accept his sacrifice. You know, he quickly prepared a young goat and some unleavened bread and placed it on a rock as guided by the angel. You know, the angel then touched the sacrifice with the tip of his spear, consuming the sacrifice. Now, for time's sake this morning, I'm going to summarize verses 25 through 35. But after this assurance, the angel left Gideon to perform his duty. The Lord tells Gideon to destroy his father's altar to Baal and the Ashtaroth pole beside it. Gideon obeys, but does so by night out of fear of his family and even the townspeople. The next morning, when the people discovered the altar destroyed, they demanded Gideon's death. However, Gideon's father, Joash, defends him, challenging Baal to defend himself if he truly is a god. And as a result, Gideon is given the nickname Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal contend against us. And the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon, and he blows a trumpet to summon the tribes of Israel, particularly the Abiezrites, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, to join him in fighting the Midianites. And this marks the beginning of Gideon's role as a military leader and a judge in Israel. And so skip with me, if you would, to verses 36. For time's sake, we're going to pick up in verse 36, still in Judges 6. Now I'm going to just finish the chapter here all the way through 40. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, it wrung out enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry only on the fleece only, and all the ground let it there be dew." And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, and all the ground there was dew. So like us, Gideon asked for yet another sign of confirmation, just so we know, okay, is this God really speaking to me? Or, okay, what shall I be doing? Etc. We may ask God, if this is what I'm supposed to be doing, show me X, Y, Z. God does X, Y, Z, and then we say, okay, how about A, B, C? Well, God again confirms with A, B, C. I don't think that idea is foreign to Gideon there. I think all of us have probably questioned God to some degree in that same format. I believe this shows Gideon's humanity. He was just as us. He wasn't a superhuman or some super pure spiritual man beyond who we are. He was an ordinary individual just as you and I. And he wanted confirmation, as we often do. He wanted to know that God is truly with him and calling him to this role. He needed God's assurance, to continue with strength and courage. Courage is not being afraid. Courage is continuing in strength even when afraid. Oftentimes we need that same courage that comes from confirmation from God himself so that we know to continue in his calling for our life. God's will can often feel like the exact opposite of what we want to do. It would be easy to say or to stay in our own place of hiding, crushing down our own grains of wheat and remaining silent. But God often calls us out of our comfort zone, not as a way to intimidate or scare us, but as a way to use us for his glory and to those around us. Majority of the time, these requests of confirmation are not a lack of faith, but rather to gain strength, we require to remain confident and courageous and to do the desire of God's will for our life. I'm going to pick up in verse 1 in chapter 7. Read the first 7 verses here. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moriah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, and anyone whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink, and the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who have lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go every man to his home. So look at this. Like us, we may be going along just fine. Doing what God has appointed us, for this current time, and then all of a sudden, once we think we have it all figured out and it's going well, God throws a curveball. But we too can be as Gideon. Obey when it makes no sense to us. Faith is often demonstrated by obedience in the face of fear or confusion. After all, it's courageous. We will soon see that God honors our trust and obedience. All right. So skip on down, chapter 7, verse 16. I'm going to read all through verse 23. And as he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets in their hands of all of them, and empty jars and torches inside the jars. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, and when they had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow, and they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the enemy, and the army fled as far as Bethshet, I can't even say that, Bethshittah, towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Moliah, I don't even know, so Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out of Naphtali and from Asher and from all of Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. So trumpets, jars, and torches, not swords, won the battle. The weapons or tools made no sense. They seemed silly and odd, but Gideon obeyed. Gideon was used for what he was divinely appointed. Like us, there may be times where God tells us to do something that seems silly or strange. But God knows what he's doing. God knows why he asks us to do X, Y, Z, even when we may think A, B, C makes more sense. God can use us even when it seems like all odds are against us. God can use you to do the extraordinary, even though you may feel as ordinary as the simplest person. The tools may seem foolish, while the task may seem too simple or even too difficult. But trust the tools are divinely appointed, and God will bring the success through our obedience, just as he did with Gideon. The victory does not lie with you and I. The victory belongs to God. If you look at the whole summary of this story, it does seem pretty silly. Gideon's hiding out in a wine press, threshing wheat, so that he don't get his wheat stolen and possibly lose his life. And then all of a sudden, when God finds him in that condition, what does God send the messenger to call him out as? Hey, weakling, hiding, it's your time. No. He says, "Oh, mighty man of valor." That's who Gideon was in God. And so you and I, we can step out in the potential that we have in God. If God's calling us to do something, we don't have to be afraid of where we are in the moment. Oftentimes we will feel unequipped for times when God calls us out. So that he receives the glory, like with the army. Think about it. He started off with 32,000 men. And then all of a sudden, what happened? God said, "Hey, that's too much for me to get my glory. Send some away that are scared." Then he lost 22,000 of that. So just imagine being Gideon. You had this army of 32,000 troops ready to go after this camp. And then all of a sudden, God takes that 32,000 down to 10,000. And then you might be thinking, man, there's only a third of us that remain. What's the odds of this? And then God does what? Throws another curveball. Said, "Hey, still too many." And then he gets you down to 300. And why did God say he did that? So that he gets the glory. And oftentimes I think in our own callings, God will call us to do things that might feel uncomfortable at the beginning. But yet when we step out in faith, just as Gideon saw, we see where God proves himself. The tools. Gideon didn't even use a sword there. He used trumpets, torches, and clay jars. Sometimes what God provides us to do and the equipment that he gives us, it might seem silly. In all aspects, you take this tactic here to any military commander, they're going to laugh at it. Say it'll never work. Trust the tools that God has equipped you with in your life in this moment to perform his calling. Because every one of us serve a purpose for God. Every one of us has a calling in our life for God. That calling is going to look different than maybe the person sitting next to you. The tools might be different. But trust that what God has equipped you with, he will use for his glory. And that he can use you this morning, as ordinary as you may feel, he can use you to do the extraordinary. All it takes is a little bit of faith. Step out and be a little courageous. Doesn't mean that you might not be timid, but trust the one who is with you to carry you through your through that timid. So the conclusion in all this is Gideon's story is a testimony that God delights in using the ordinary to do the extraordinary. It is not about who we are, but who God is and whether we're willing to say yes. So what wine press are you hiding in? Step out, be courageous, trust God, let him use you. Find your purpose and fulfillment in God's will for your life. No matter how we may view the situation, whether it be too small or too great, seek God for his will and trust him to carry you and to use you to perform that will, to equip you to perform that will. The story of Gideon, there was nothing special about Gideon the beginning of chapter 6. But yet when God came to him and he called him, God was able to use Gideon through his faith and obedience to deliver the nation of Israel. Oftentimes, we may wonder what is God's will for our life. We may feel like, man, I'm just not really doing anything. Go to God with it. But I assure you, he will reveal his will for you in the current state where we are. And then, once we step out in faith, God will continue to equip us further and further to be used for his glory. What better way could we spend in our life than performing the will of God for our life? You want contentment in your life? Step into the will of God. You want to feel successful? You want to feel accomplished? Step into the will of God for your life. I'm going to go ahead and start my closing here if musicians want to come back up. Are we hiding out in our own winepress? Are we being fearful of that which God is calling us? Does the method, task, or calling that God has you performing right now seem too difficult, seem too silly, or even too simple? Remember, we see throughout the scriptures the affirming message that God's ways are not our ways. It's not about who we are, but who God is and whether we're willing to have faith to say yes. Whether the task is simple or difficult, what God is calling us to do now, no matter what we may think we should be doing or where we should be doing it, walking in God's will is the perfect place to be. We see, too, throughout the scriptures that God responds well to obedience. He blesses obedience. He provides during obedience. God uses ordinary, unlikely people to do the extraordinary. Though it may make no sense to us, God is wanting to use us for his glory. And if you feel God calling you to do this or that, trust him. Pursue that for your life and see what God can do through you. Just as Gideon was in the wine press hiding out when God called him, it wasn't until he was obedient that God was able to perform the miraculous through him. Let us focus today be the calling that God has for our lives. Let's ignore the fear, ignore what seems logical, ignore what we would rather be doing, and even the ordinary. Instead, let us focus on the voice of God. I'm going to read this one verse, and then I'm going to turn it over to our worship team. 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong.